Alright, we had to get a little sentimental here. This is the last of the videos that I will be doing this year, being that I already have a World War II to the present one made. So, you got Serenaded with Little Purple Rain this morning. That pumps you up to learn some AP Euro. Alright, so today we're going to talk about basically from World War I through this interwar period and then like through World War II and a little bit of the beginnings of the Cold War. I'll kind of touch as it relates to World War II and how World War II ends. And then I'll wrap up and do, there's a slide at the very end of this PowerPoint about women in this period too. So let's get going. So World War I, okay, so we talked about this in class actually yesterday with, being able to simply remember the causes of World War I as militarism, alliances, imperialism, national. There's four main causes, right? So it creates a nice little acronym for you to remember. And remember this, like all of these, this kind of snowball towards World War I really starts picking up when Germany unifies in 1870. But I think let's go all the way back to the Congress of Vienna and this concert system that had prevented large-scale wars from happening in the early 1800s, that is going to kind of fall apart with the Crimean War in 1853. And so after that, and then certainly then once Germany unifies, is that we're going to be kind of working our way towards, like I said, this massive conflict. And how that starts is that so a couple of things. One, Germany is almost instantaneously a massive industrial power. They become, probably the most powerful country for sure on the continent. I think you could maybe argue even in Europe in general. And so what ends up happening is that, like, because there's this new balance of power, Germany starts to demand that they have rights to colonies just like the other countries do. And so that's the whole Berlin Conference that's called in 1884, where they basically sit down and the European countries carve up Africa, and without trying to go to war over that. And so I think like that's the first part. Now, when we really start accelerating towards World War I is that once Wilhelm removes Bismarck and Wilhelm starts making decisions for Germany, he makes a number of mistakes that essentially put Russia and France and Britain in opposition to German sort of aggression and German agitation and all that kind of stuff. So I kind of understand like those are the kind of the long-term effects that are causing or cause. These are the long-term causes that are sort of bringing about World War I. Now in the short run, this conflict, like I said this in class yesterday, should have just been a small conflict between like Serbian nationalists and Austrian government, because the Serbians in this Balkan region wanted a nationalistic independent government from the Austrians. And like this is kind of a trend for the Austrian Empire throughout the 1800s, certainly after 1848 when Metternich has to flee, and so like their multinational state had problems as nationalism grows, and so a Serbian nationalist is going to assassinate the Archduke or the Prince for the Austrian Empire, and that conflict then is what essentially causes this whole war. Is that it's the Russians had an agreement with the Serbians, the Germans had an agreement with the Austrians, and the French had an agreement with the Russians. And then when Germany attacks France through Belgium, Belgium had an agreement with Britain. And so like suddenly this becomes this massive world war, when it really is just like a war over independence. And maybe I don't know if you call it, maybe I don't know what you would call it, if it's revolution or whatnot, but like that small conflict, because of this alliance system, becomes a massive world war. And so when World War I starts, Germany had done a lot of As like the alliance system had sort of solidified in the period leading up to World War One, German military leaders had done a lot of studying of like, okay, well, we're basically surrounded by our enemies, and that was one of the things that Bismarck didn't want to happen. So like Bismarck was was very um, like thoughtful about not doing exactly what Wilhelm did, and basically you have enemies on all sides. And so what the German leaders concluded is that they called this the Schlieffen plan, which is like you have to attack France first. You go up through Belgium, and then you attack France through the north. You go and you take out Paris, and then you turn your army around, and then you go and attack Russia. And they thought because of the size of Russia and the slow movement of the Russian government, that they could essentially have a couple weeks before the Russians would be fully mobilized and ready to go to war, and that they needed to preemptively attack in order to have the best chance at making a quick sort of invasion of France work. And so they do that, and now they do that with some atrocities. So like people make like a huge deal of like the rape of Belgium and like how they go through and they're slaughtering people, and it gets way overblown. Now they do some bad stuff and they kill civilians and all that kind of stuff, which is not good. Um, but the extent to which like these these German Huns are like savaging Belgian people, like that gets way overblown, and that is actually used by propaganda by French and British and even American anti-German people, that like, hey, like the Germans are some savages and like they're clearly the bad side in this war. And that's one of the big differences between World War One and World War Two. Like when we talk about American involvement in World War Two, there very clearly was a bad side. Um, and in World War One, it's not really the case. I mean, they're all like, I mean, and remember, they're all cousins anyway. So like, I mean, the Wilhelm was the cousin of the King of England at that time, and who was cousins to the Tsar in Russia, and they're all like related in different ways. Um, but the Schleifen plan case, so they get very close to Paris, and this is that like that famous story where like the French the leader of the French army um, is like telling taxi cab drivers to like basically round up any men that he could find, or any men that they could find, and like force them to drive them to the fronts. Um, and like because the Germans get very close to Paris, but eventually kind of get bogged down, and that's when they start digging trenches, and that's the whole like Western Front trench warfare develops for the next couple years all along that sort of Western Front. Um, and so remember, I think you could really argue this in some different ways, but World War One is definitely the first instance of like what we would call total warfare, where the government like gets involved to like mobilize populations with drafts. The government gets involved with like making sure the government, and the reason I say I think this is arguable, because essentially this is what the radical government does during the French Revolution. They install a draft. The government has total control of the economy, so they're producing enough food, they're producing enough weapons, they're producing enough war goods, cars, all that kind of stuff. You also like, and this is maybe some differences with World War One, is that like now you start to have women working in factories. And you're going to have, from women's influence in this sort of total war, you're going to have women get the right to vote in most countries after World War One. You're also going to have governments start to create propaganda for the war effort, and I think in some ways you could talk about how like this more government control during the war in order to like kind of run the war is going to set a precursor for totalitarianism in Germany, in Italy, and other places after the war. All right, so during World War One, during World War One, you're gonna have the Russian Revolution, and the Russian Revolution we've talked a lot about, but remember, so I think even with all of Russia's problems, I don't think you have a Russian Revolution without the war. The war is sort of this context for all these problems that the Russians had been experiencing. To like it provides the opportunity for the government to be destabilized enough for a revolution to take place. And so remember, the Russians are getting beaten horribly by the Germans. Nicholas is not a military leader, and his military leaders that he does have in the army are making bad decisions, and the Germans are destroying them, and they start to destroy like food supplies, and so shortages of food are going to worsen. Nicholas is at one point going to have to leave the government, and he goes to the front lines and an attempt to kind of get the troops all rallied together and like make one more effort to kind of hold the lines. However, like that's going to be unsuccessful. And so what ends up happening then, as this war effort kind of falls apart, the Russian army in St. Petersburg refuses to put down like demonstrations and strikes, which then forced Nicholas to basically abdicate, so he fled. And then this provisional government is going to be set up, and then this provisional government like had to share government power with socialists, and they continued to fight the war, and which was unsuccessful. And so, with a little bit of help from the Germans, because they understood that like this was like returning Lenin to Russia at this time was like, you know, playing with matches next to gasoline. But so Lenin is going to get returned to St. Petersburg. At St. Petersburg, Lenin's going to start urging people to overthrow the government. And so this is essentially what causes the second revolution. Because remember, the Russian Revolution is really two revolutions. There's one in the spring, there's one in the fall. And the spring revolution kind of tries to set up this democratic government, and then this fall revolution is the Bolshevik revolution that brings Lenin into power. And like his message is peace, land, and bread. And so like he wanted to end the war, he wanted to give people land, and he wanted to give people food. And so once Lenin gets into power in that Bolshevik revolution in the fall, he's going to immediately end the war. He signs a very, very, very unpopular peace agreement with the Germans because he gave up a huge chunk of Western Russia. And so, like that is massively. And this is one of the things that gets kind of undersold is that, because remember, like France and Britain hated the Germans and like blamed the Germans for World War I. But at the Treaty of Versailles, they don't even invite the communists there. And so like this treaty that Lenin signs with the Germans, like they didn't want to give that land to Germany, and they didn't want to give that land back to the Russians. And so this like they create a bunch of countries in Eastern Europe after World War I, essentially all this land that the Germans had taken from the Russians. So that's kind of like this interesting effect of World War I too, is like Poland, Czechoslovakia, like then the Austrian Empire gets broken into a bunch of different countries. So then you have like Austria, Romania, Hungary. So it's interesting to think about like what could have been for Germany if they could have won here. All right, so because this conflict, this peace agreement is so unpopular, civil war is going to break out, and they're unhappy with communism, and so you have this whites who are like the capitalists, non-Bolsheviks versus the Reds, who are the Bolsheviks. Leon Trotsky is going to be like the leader of the Red Army. His military tactics largely help Lenin's army win the Civil War, and this is really important because, you could even talk about how in the Civil War, the beginnings of the Cold War are kind of foreshadowed because the Americans are going to help the whites try to win this Civil War here in Russia. Now, the Bolsheviks are able to win, Lenin is going to essentially approve many of the actions that the peasants had already taken. So like the peasants had already taken land, working class industrialists had already kind of taken over the factories, and so he kind of basically just says like, yeah, that's cool, keep doing that, and so like that helps him gain popularity. Um, Lenin doesn't, and his party doesn't win the first elections that they hold, so he kind of says, all right, we're going to stop doing that. And initially, there's a lot of friction there, so there's the civil war kind of happening, and then there's this kind of friction between like elections, and Lenin just kind of throwing that out. Um, and so initially, Lenin has to be kind of dic- like a dictator. Um, but what's going to be interesting about Lenin's rule is that Lenin starts to put his new economic plan, the NEP, which is going to establish some like limited economic freedom and like some capitalism into it. So it's basically was like you as like peasants and as like national industry, like you have like quotas to essentially meet, and whatever like that quota you have to meet, and that's like the government's. Whatever you want to grow over that top of that, like you can, sell on the open market as your own. And so like this is really important because not only is it successful, but it helps Lenin become more successful and more popular as he kind of goes into the last year of his rule. Um, and so like Lenin's going to die in 1924 without a chosen successor. Stalin starts very quickly kind of like consolidating power. Um, Remember Stalin's like whole motto was like he basically promised his competitors high-ranking positions in the government as long as they supported him. And so that's kind of how he kind of works his way to the top. And then once he gets into power, he goes about like purging all of the Bolsheviks, and he purges all of like Lenin's old like comrades. Uh, he gets rid of the NEP. Um, he like basically creates what we consider the Soviet Union is like like Russia is going to control all these satellite states, and um, these Soviet republics aren't going to really be given any real independence. It's going to be basically Russia and their cronies. Um, and then like you could talk about this as like kind of Stalin's second revolution, because this is when we start having the 5-year plans, which really greatly increase economic output, like industrial success. But this is also kind of like the second revolution, and like this is when the peasants are kind of put under control of the state. This is when they do the forced like collectivization of agriculture and move peasants onto massive like collective farms. Um, like basically Stalin has to kill like massive amounts of peasants to get them to fall in line. There's no way that's right. Like there's 304 million is that's a typo. Um, I don't know what that's supposed to be. That's supposed to be like 3.4 or what, but or maybe it's 324. Uh, yeah, it's probably what it was. Like Stalin is probably has to kill like 3 to 4 million peasants to get them in line because they were rebuffing him. All right, where were we? All right, so sorry, I'm trying to do this before school starts and keep getting interrupted. All right, so World War One. We look at kind of effects of this. All right, Americans kind of come in at the last minute and kind of help offset the transfer of Germans from the Western Front. Remember, because like as Germany once the Russian Revolution happens, uh, the Bolsheviks pull Russia out of the war, and so German soldiers can start going back to the Western Front. But that's about the same time that Americans are starting to pour into France. And so this is like remember the big reason why the Germans have to sue for peace, even though their armies were in France at that time, is that the British naval blockade was effectively like starving out the German population, and like the German people were starting to kind of push back against the government because things had gotten really bad in Germany. Um, And so, and remember, that's like, again, that's a good example of total warfare too, is like the British like understanding like, hey, if we just starve the Germans out, eventually they're gonna not want to fight war anymore. Um, so eventually Wilhelm has to abdicate. Germany becomes a republic, and a couple days later, that German republic is going to sue for peace. Now, when we get to the Treaty of Versailles, we've talked a ton about this, and how like France and Britain basically don't want to, um, go with America's 14, well, President Wilson's 14 points. And even though Germany and Austria are there, they're not allowed to participate. They don't even, like I said, don't even invite Russia. So Germany's going to lose big. They have to accept blame for causing the war. They have to pay massive reparations for that. They're going to lose a lot of their colonies to Britain. They lose chunks of its territory. So they lose Alsace and Lorraine in western Germany, and then they basically lose all of that eastern territory that they had taken from the Russians. Their military is limited to 100,000 troops, and they're forbidden to have offensive weapons. And the Rhineland was to be demilitarized and occupied by Allies. And remember, the Rhineland's important because that's where all the industrial power came from in Germany. You could talk about like other effects of this sort of Treaty of Versailles. They create a bunch of different countries. So I've already kind of mentioned that. So Austria, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania are just some of the newly created states. They create the League of Nations, even though like its problem is that like they don't, like League of Nations never had a military, and the U.S. never joins, so it's not very effective. And both of those things are going to be changed in the United Nations, which is formed after World War II. If we look at some of the other kind of like social, political effects, we're going to have greater social equality because of all the death and destruction. You're going to have the growth of government power. You're going to have the end of some royal dynasties that had been in place for a long time. The Habsburgs, Romanovs, Hohenzollerns are like all going to be removed. Then you also have the end of the Ottoman Empire. You're going to see a shift in world power towards the United States, especially financial. So after World War I, New York kind of becomes the financial capital of the world. And then like culturally or intellectually, you kind of have the growth of existentialism. This whole like interwar period is going to be characterized by what they'll call like this lost generation, and how like all the literature and art is going to be tainted by this sort of existential belief that, hey, maybe life doesn't really have any meaning, and like human existence is just by chance. There's no kind of like special purpose here. And that's so like there's a bunch of literature in the 20s, both in America and in Europe, about that kind of like go along with those sort of themes. You're going to see this interwar period, like government is going to be used by, or radio is going to be used by governments to increase propaganda. It's also going to be used to increase advertising to people, and increase consumerism. And so, and I think like that's kind of one of the things that is going to help guide some of these changes in the 20s is should be like widespread improvements in technology and mass production techniques like the assembly line that are going to, you can produce high quantities of goods at very efficiently, at lower costs. You can sell them cheaper. You're gonna have mass transportation. So like car culture really starts to take off after World War I, in the 20s with cheaper cars. And so the things that get asked most about this interwar period on AP exams have to do with like how the Britain and the U.S. are going to essentially leave France out to dry, and so like France is going to basically enforce the Treaty of Versailles very harshly on Germany, and so like France is going to basically force Germany to pay up, and because Germany can't pay its bills, and because France can't pay its bills to the U.S., nor can Britain, is like the U.S. comes up with like what was called the Dawes Plan, and essentially, so like Germany is, this is when like people are paying for loaves of bread with like wheelbarrows full of money, like ridiculous things. Like the German economy is in the tank, and it's in chaos, and the government's kind of falling apart, and the U.S. kind of steps in and is like, okay, we got like, not only can we make a lot of money here, but we got to kind of help this. And so the U.S. steps in and says like, well, if we give loans to Germany, and then Germany starts paying back France and Britain for their reparations, well, Britain and France, some of that money that Britain and France are going to get from Germany is going to end up back in the United States, because the United States had loaned massive amounts to those two countries during World War One. So basically, you give money to Germany at interest that eventually is going to come back to you anyways. And so you're making money on giving money that's going to come back to you. So it's like they developed this sort of wonderful scheme that kind of from 1924 to 1929 like improves relationships between all these countries. It's called the hopeful years. The economies improve in these countries. Like in 26, like Germany's going to enter the League of Nations. In 28, there's like 60 countries that signed what was called the Kellig-Briand Pact, which outlawed war. And so like this is, all things are trending in the right direction. The problem is in 1929, the U.S. is going to sort of stumble into the Great Depression, and that once the American economy falls into this depression, well, America's not, is the money that was going to Germany that was kind of propping up this whole system dries out. And so, like this is essentially like the Great Depression is going to hit Germany the worst, and then the United States the worst too. But I mean, this is European history. France is interesting because France is really affected by the Great Depression. They kind of flirt with fascism a little bit. There's these sort of popular front governments that spring up in the mid 1930s. But like this depression that starts in 1929 is essentially what helps. Like the Nazis have been kind of growing in popularity throughout the 20s, but it's the depression and the effects of the depression on Europe that helped bring about like Nazi rule in Germany. Now, fascism in Mussolini's rule had quickly grown right after World War One. Okay, so fascism grows in Italy essentially right after World War One. Now, Hitler is going to try to do a lot of the same right after World War One in Germany, just unsuccessfully, and then like he's got to kind of revamp his policies and his strategy in order to get back into power. But remember, so Mussolini is going to be responding to like post World War One. Italy is really going to struggle. So Italy went to the Treaty of Versailles thinking that they were going to get paid, right? So it's like, hey, we're on the winning side. Like this should be good for us. And then like they don't really get any of the spoils of war, and so they're really pissed off. And so like the public is mad that like they kind of view like they got slighted. The economy is really struggling in Italy after World War One. And so the government is having problems. Socialism starts to creep in, and you used to have more and more sort of socialist parties growing in popularity. And so what ends up happening is that Mussolini basically took advantage of these conservative, like rich people's fear of socialism, and like used that conservative fear to essentially like grow support for fascism and the fascist party. And so when Mussolini's party like marches on Rome, they call it the Black Shirts, they basically like intimidate the government into like giving Mussolini power. And then by 1926, Mussolini has created a dictatorship. Now, once Mussolini gets into power, he totally censors the press, so it's like really, like it's almost totally state controlled. He's going to outlaw competing political parties. He's going to create youth organizations to start to indoctrinate young people. He's going to start spying on his people with his secret police, even though this is not anything like Hitler has in Germany. Mussolini also has some really bizarre like women's policies towards women. So like he basically forces women to like stay in home and like make as many babies as they can. He wanted the population in Italy to grow bigger and bigger as a bigger army, more people to work in factories, better economy in countries. So they like women were giving like bonuses, prizes, etc. for having more kids. which kind of is weird. All right, so Hitler. Remember, so after 1929, this is really going to accelerate. But Hitler had tried in the early 1920s to try to gain power, and we talked a lot about that. How like that whole like beer hall push. Like he tries to incite a rebellion in Munich in the 1920s, and he's thrown in jail for that. Uh, he that's where he goes and he writes Mein Kampf while he's in jail, My Struggle. And so, like, once he gets out of jail, he starts trying to revamp his strategy. Instead of overthrowing the government, he basically wanted Nazis to, like, infiltrate the government and, like, overthrow the government from within, and that's essentially what he does. And so, like, Hitler kind of quickly starts to gain power in the government, and by 1932, he's named chancellor. Um, and so what happens then is that, like, from 1932, um, the Hitler is going to start to use government power to become a dictator. Um, and many people will say that he started the fire, but like so there's a fire in the German like legislative like the Reichstag, like the legislative building where their Congress was, and there's a fire there, and like Hitler goes and he blames it on the socialists and said like communists are trying to overthrow the country, and so he uses that as like he goes the government says like I need um, total power, give me more power so we can stamp out this like communist threat, and that's the Enabling Act, and then so like they basically give Hitler total power, and I think it was only supposed to be for like a year, like there was a term on it like hey we're only going to give you total power for I forget if it's like a year or 2 years whatever it was. Um, But obviously, like Hitler never gives that power back, right? So like as soon as he has total power, um, and like he starts purging opponents from the government, he starts um, moving Jews into ghettos. He starts like taking assets away from people that were enemies to the Nazi Party, um, and so like this basis for this totalitarian state. I mean, essentially, Germany goes from being like a struggling democracy, but I mean, like, it's the Great Depression. I mean, just like America was struggling. But basically, in a couple year span, I mean, there's a 3-4 year window here where, like, Germany goes from democracy to totalitarian government just like that. And so, um, that's kind of a crazy thing and how quickly Hitler is able to consolidate power there. All right, so in the lead up to World War II, Hitler is going to utilize like government contracts in order to basically rebuild the German economy, which makes him extremely popular with his people. And so by 1937, like Germany has basically no unemployment. And this is why I think it's in like 1934, 1935, like Hitler's is like Tom's Person of the Year. And just like the reason I think that explains a lot of like why German people were like went to Great Lakes and did crazy things for Hitler and this during this war is that like well like in this run up to the war like Hitler to some extent had saved the German economy and like had given people something to believe in, and like they host the Olympics uh, during this time, and like he just like basically they go from very much struggling to being the strongest country in Europe again. And so like in 1935 is really when you start to see Hitler starting to break the terms of the Treaty of Versailles, and this is kind of like when we start getting into the gray areas, like is France, is Britain going to respond to this? Because Hitler starts to build up his army. A year later, Hitler starts to remilitarize the Rhineland. And so, like, this is Britain and France are starting to say, like, hey, Hitler, you can't do these things, but they don't really respond strongly. In 1938, I kind of think this is, like, the breaking point because in 1938, like, in the Hitler's going to take Austria, and then he's going to take like the whole country of Austria is going to become part of Germany, and then he's going to take a big chunk of Czechoslovakia, which was called the Sudetenland, and this is what leads to the Berlin Conference, And then basically in the Berlin Conference, they say, all right, Hitler, like, and the Hitler's claims, remember, are that like, hey, the Austrian people are really Germans, and this area in Czechoslovakia that he took, like, he claimed that they were German people, that he was just reuniting with Germany. Um, and so France and Britain in the Berlin Conference are like, okay, Hitler, like, this is like, we'll agree to these terms that, and you can have these territories, but this is it. Like, you can't take any more land, any more of this, and this is essentially war. And in 1939, what happens is Hitler invades the rest of Czechoslovakia, um, and like they don't do anything. And this is one of those things when we talked about in class is like, remember after the war, like after World War II, there was a lot of Eastern Europeans that were very wary of Western European powers because they basically like they kept saying like, Hitler, you can't invade this country. Hitler, you can't do this. And then like when he actually did it, like Austrians and Czechoslovakians were basically like left up to Hitler. And even Poland, when you look at Poland, is like Poland's going to get invaded, and that's going to essentially kick off World War II. But when like Poland gets invaded, like the French or the British don't respond with war right away. And in fact, like when Hitler invaded Poland, they gave him an ultimatum. They said, hey, Hitler, I know you've sent your armies into Poland, but we'll give you 24 hours if you pull your army out. Like, we don't have to fight this war. And so it's like, when we talk about like Stalin and creating those satellite states and making sure that those satellite states become Soviet possessions, and not align with the West, like, now I think like the Marshall Plan and American money would have maybe eventually won over these countries, but like at least initially, I'm not sure that they would have viewed Western influences real favorably, um, because of how like this all kind of unfolds in the beginning of the war. Um, all right, so when you look at some other things, all right, so some people called this like this early start of the phony war. I mean, it takes a while for Hitler to like basically rearm and start to initiate the second stage of his war, which is essentially like in the summer of 1940, he essentially conquers all of Western Europe except for Britain, right? And so like he's conquered Denmark, Belgium, France, has created a peace agreement with Hitler. That's what creates that Vichy government. And then sort of in like a horrible mistake, like Hitler breaks his peace agreement that he had with Stalin before he had beaten the British, and so like Hitler breaks his army up and splits his army up into two, um, which ends up being kind of his fatal mistake. And we talked about like Dunkirk, and that, if you haven't seen that movie, that's a really good movie to just watch. It's historically accurate, and it's a very important turning point early in the war. Is that like essentially Hitler allows the British army to escape back to England, and so. What you want to know about World War II, and remember, like they don't ask a ton of like battle questions about World War II. In fact, I don't think I've ever seen that. Um, like the turning points in this war, obviously America getting involved with Pearl Harbor, and like the American military production and military might that comes with that basically is gonna like supply the British, the French, and the Russians to some extent with like the weapons that they need to help fight off the Germans. And really, what ends up happening with the German army is just spread way too thin. Like uh, Hitler's fighting the British in bombing the British in Britain. He's fighting the British in North Africa and the French in North Africa. Well, once the Vichy government capitulates, then it's just the British and Americans. He's fighting the in the Balkan region, and that he has to take that over because the Italians suck at war. He's fighting the Russians in the east, and so like the German army was just spread way too thin and all around Europe, and so like that largely explains why like and then obviously the influence of the American military is going to obviously play a big role in that too. Because once you got to understand when the Allies start this war, they realize that Hitler's the bigger threat than Japan is, and so much of the Allied military strategy is going to focus on taking care of Hitler first. Once they start to realize that in 43, 44, 45 that we're going to win the war, they start having conferences to figure out how this is going to work. The biggest of the two, and the two that you would need to know for your AP exam, is the Yalta Conference and the Potsdam Conference. And this is important because in Yalta, at the first conference, that Stalin is going to agree to let Eastern Europe have free elections, and if they choose to be Soviet and communist, then they do, and if they don't, so be it. They also decide in Yalta that they're going to divide Germany into occupied zones that are all going to kind of get a piece of Germany. Now, in the course of ending the war in Europe, so Potsdam is like a suburb of Berlin. Once they get to Potsdam, and Germany has at this point surrendered, is that in this last conference that they hold, is that Stalin's going to reverse his position on free elections and not going to allow like Eastern Europe to decide what kind of governments they want to have. And so like Stalin had basically made up his mind that like the Russians had been invaded by Germany twice in a 25-year span at that point, and that he was going to use those Eastern European countries as kind of like buffer states. It's also like the U.S. That's kind of misleading. The U.S. doesn't use the atomic weapons on Japan during the conference. The U.S. like Truman realized that during the conference that they had successfully tested an atomic bomb. All right, so if you get a question about like why did Germany lose or what factors account for it, politically, you should know that like Hitler chooses his allies wrong. Okay, so Italy and Japan, especially because Japan brings America in the war, were not like very good allies for Germany. You could talk about the production capacity of allies and like the fact that like the American economy is going to produce. It's some ridiculous output. Like the Americans produce like 10 times more war goods than Japan does, and it's like 8 times more war goods than Germany does just by themselves. And so like we largely are responsible for, at least in terms of like making the products that are going to help win the war. Now, remember, the Russians are going to take the biggest brunt of this, and I think the Russians largely, help they take the biggest chunk of defeating the Germans, because there's like 20 million Russians that die in this war, and they just, the Russians beat the Germans not because they're better fighters or better military strategists, like by brute force, it's just pure numbers. I think the other thing with Germany losing this war is like Hitler decides he's going to fight a 3-front war. He didn't have to start the war with the Soviets. He never conquered Britain, and so like that's obviously going to be important. And then like Stalingrad ends up being like the big turning point in the East, like biggest chunk of I think more German soldiers die in Stalingrad and get captured in Stalingrad than the United States loses in the whole war or something crazy like that. So. All right, last slide here. So we talk about women and changes to women in this period. Like I would just recognize that this is a really important period of change for women. So many countries gave women the right to vote in World War I, but their roles in factories did play an important sort of aspect in that. Women's place in doing World War I or helping World War I is going to be like important. We haven't really talked about Amelia Pankhurst. Like I would definitely know that name. She's the one that really is like probably the most vocal, supporter of and leader of the women's suffrage movement in Britain. And so like that's a name you should know. But then basically between the wars, there's kind of this interesting period because the fascists are going to be very sort of negative towards women in the sense that like, hey, like women need to stay in the home, they need to produce babies, they need to indoctrinate kids. And that's maybe a little bit of a difference between like even Mussolini and Hitler, is that Mussolini's policies were much more I don't know, like Hitler understood the importance of women and basically being able to control women and use women as a tool to like indoctrinate kids and then create a more patriotic, nationalistic state. Um, but like then, for example, like when the Russian Revolution happens, like the communists declared that like women had full equality. That was whether that actually like bared out in real life, it's arguable. But at least at its face, women had equal rights. Um, so then there's like this period, and then so women largely do a lot of the same sort of helping roles in World War II, just to a larger extent because World War II is a bigger war. Um, and so like a lot of the changes that started in after World War I just get amplified after World War II. After World War II, women started marrying earlier, um, and women are going to kind of start to go on divergent paths. So more and more young women are going to start going to school after World War II and to college as like opportunities in colleges, universities expand. Um, and but like upper class women are still going to try to like do the whole like housekeeping, like home mother type thing. Um, you're also going to see the size of families are going to be reduced, especially after like the 1960s and moving forward from the 1960s because birth control. So they go right away after World War II. Family sizes are going to increase quite a bit. There's this like big population boom, but then like in the 60s that slows down considerably, and I think birth control is largely responsible for that. And like slowly but surely, women are going to become bigger parts of the workforce in Western Europe. And like I think like the two um, women that you need to know in this post World War II like feminists, um, I would know Simone Beauvoir is like she writes the whole like second sex, um, and like that like women were politically and essentially free and had equal rights, but like that they needed to become more like assertive and like more um, like that like women were essentially were like politically and like by their rights had equal rights to men, but like that women essentially like allowed themselves to be the second class citizens because the way that they allowed men to kind of treat them and the role that they took in the homes. So she's going to argue that like, hey, we shouldn't do this. This is like you're allowing yourself to be like treated less than equal. um, and then the feminist mystique is written in 1963, and that's basically like, hey, you shouldn't allow like your husband to basically force you to stay in the house, and that like women were like basically forced to conform to these ideas of what women were supposed to be that were created by men, and were like basically trapping women in these roles that were not conducive to um, their uh, like their best interest in their future. All right, some other goals of modern feminists. I mean, I think all these are things that have happened to some extent in the last 50 years. But like laws against discrimination, quality of workplace, you get like maternal leave and daycare, rights to divorce, abortion rights, government help for single mothers, like child support and things like that. All right, that's all I got. Roll Tide.